A very good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome Commodore R.S. Vasan. My colleague Dr. Anand will do a formal introduction to him in the sense of what he is and everything, but I would want to share a personal note, what I have been so far with him. He's been sort of a, what do you say, sort of guru for me. Though he has not formally taught me anything, but I've been extremely influenced by him. I've loved the way he has conducted himself, whether it's an academic forum or it's in the other side. In all the places, he has always been extremely accommodative, and his knowledge is phenomenal, which I've enjoyed listening to every other talk that he has delivered. We have met so many times in Kerala and many other places as well. So it's just another expression of my gratitude to him for having accepted to deliver this lecture. He had offered even before, but we just found a right time. But we will be doing many more events and other things. We would expect the Chennai Center for China Studies to help us out with under his leadership. So now I would request my colleague Dr. Anand to introduce Commodore Vasan to the audience. Thank you.
Hello all. I would like to introduce our special guest today, Commodore Seshadri Vasan, an alumnus of the Defense Services Staff College of the Naval War College and the International Visitor Leadership Program. Commodore Seshadri Vasan has a distinguished service of over 34 years in the Navy and the Coast Guard. His appointments include command of warships, 2 major air stations, and a maritime air squadron. He has participated both in the 1971 war and IPKF operations. He was an instructor at the Naval War College, India. Prior to retirement, he was the regional commander of the Indian Coast Guard Region East, overseeing the EEZ patrol, SAR, anti-piracy, fisheries protection, maritime border control, marine pollution prevention, and other maritime tasks in the Bay of Bengal. Post-retirement, he has served in many think tanks and is a regular speaker at many international and national conferences. He was also the chairman of the Aeronautical Society of India, Chennai's charter, and the president of the Navy Foundation Chennai chapter. He has many publications to his credit in journals, websites, edited books, and media. The think tanks that he has served in include Observer Research Foundation, where he steered the Maritime Security Program, the Center for Asia Studies, where he is the head of the Strategy and Security Studies, director of the Chennai Center for China Studies, director of the Asian Bureau of World Border Patrol, and as the regional director of the National Maritime Foundation, Tamil Nadu. He is also a visiting faculty at the Indian Maritime University, Academy of Maritime Education and Training, Great Lakes Institute of Management, and Hindustan Institute of Engineering Technology. He is also on the board of advisors at the Madras University and Stella Maris College. With this introduction, I would like to invite Commodore Vasan to share his knowledge and experience on Indian Navy and its role in India's national security. Over to you, Commodore Vasan.
Thank you, Dr. Anand. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Anand. And thank you, Dr. Kishore, for inviting me. And I also share special relations with Nanda Kishore. It goes back many years, and we've been in touch with each other. We run into each other in many places, and it's always a pleasure to interact with you. This was on the cards for some time, and I'm happy it's happening now. The COVID lockdown has opened up many more doors in terms of academic engagement with students, with academia, with various people, stakeholders. So from that point of view, I'm quite happy to be here. And actually, I can complement whatever I'm saying today with additional sessions if required, because I was not very certain as to where the present lot of students who are attending today are in terms of their awareness when it comes to the Indian Navy, Indian Coast Guard, the Coastal Security Group, the Maritime Thrust of India in the new geopolitical arena that is staring us in the 21st century. So I'm quite open to being stopped at any time. This is something that has been updated recently by the Naval Headquarters. So I thought I will stick to what they have said about what their roles are and what their missions are. But however, I'm quite willing to go beyond all this during the question answer session. And also time is not a constraint as far as I am concerned. It only depends on your stamina and what we can do. Let's start the day with an interesting video that was released on the Navy Day of 2020. It's quite possible that some of you have already seen it, but I would like to show that because it shows the multi-dimensional capability of the Indian Navy, of which we are very proud of.
I, Lieutenant Ambika Swarkar, extend to you all a very warm welcome to this unique edition of this year's Indian Naval Band Festival.
I'm not going to go through the entire band concert. The idea was to just tell you and see some of these clips which are there, to give you a small history.
One of the most audacious attacks
This was Karachi, which was set on fire in 1971, where the Indian Navy came off.
Operation Trident. The attack
Air tracking station. Air tracking station. Air tracking station.
This is what you see as the missile boats, which they did not expect to go that far. We towed them all the way. I was part of 1971 war, and these were the famous missile boats, who were subsequently called killers.
Sir, can you increase the audio level of the video?
Yeah.
The clip, sir?
All right. In any case, this was to be shown only for a few minutes till the Karachi attack. I'll go back to my presentation in a couple of seconds because this is about 45 minutes. You can all see it in your own time later. This was Khyber, which was sunk with the missile attack. And all these were beyond the horizon missiles. I'll talk about it a little later. Just a minute, I'm going on to my presentation now. Just give me a minute.
Okay, sir.
That was just to take them up to the Karachi attack because it would wake up some of them, and then I can get on with my talk. Okay, good afternoon again, gentlemen, and I don't know if there's any lady out there. Great pleasure being here today. The only initial clip that I wanted to show was to tell you that the Indian Navy came of age in 1971. It's a daring attack, an audacious attack, which was carried out in support of the mission to liberate Bangladesh, then East Pakistan. So that is where various aspects of a maritime warfare or a naval warfare came to the fore. It included support to our submarines, taking ships, merchant ships for sustaining the tempo of the war, imposing a blockade on Karachi so that none of the essential supplies reached Karachi, and cutting off East Pakistan totally, and deployment of an aircraft carrier. This is the first time that the carrier really went into action in Bay of Bengal, and they carried out sustained attacks using the Alizé aircraft and the Seahawk aircraft, which were both, deck-borne, and the amount of damage that they caused in Chittagong, Cox's Bazar, Khulna, and the fact that they did not allow any of the Pakistani vessels or support troops to escape from East Pakistan made it easy for the Air Force and the Army to sustain their attack and liberate this country. Because I'm not going to the details of Bangladesh, I'm sure it's have been covered. But what I'll go through today is to, this was the latest updated missions as the Navy envisages its future. I'm sure that you also have been perhaps told about the fact that it was the Indian Navy that was the first military unit to come out with a proper doctrine. So this came out in 2005, and thereafter it's been reviewed in 2007, updated in 2009, again in 2015 and 19. So, Indian Navy has been in the forefront of looking at a doctrinal approach for bringing about a clarity in how it wants to go about it. So I will confine in the initial 30-35 minutes. Thereafter, I'll give a lot of time for you to question answer, because this is the foundational presentation for understanding what the navies of the world are expected to do. Please remember that we have a 7,516 kilometer long coastline. We have 12, 13 major ports which are sustaining the economy of this country. There are nearly 200 minor ports which are, dotting along the entire coastline, supporting fishermen, supporting small trade, including coastal trade. So, and we also have access to the Bay of Bengal on one side, the Arabian Sea on the other. And of course, we are again blessed with geography, which I can again take up during the discussion, that we have the Andaman Nicobar, which is 740 nautical miles, from the mainland on one side. And on the southwest, we have the Lakshadweep Viewpoint, which has been in the news of late. So I also may make a request and say that whoever is not using the mic can kindly mute themselves so that there is no disturbance. Thank you. So, with this kind of please remember that while successive Mughals and various others came through the land routes, we were subjugated to the maritime route. It was East India Company that came into India, through the sea routes. And we also were subjugated by the Portuguese, by the Dutch in different parts of India, whether it is Goa, whether it is Pondicherry, Daman and Diu, or to some extent even some of the other southern states which were temporarily under siege by the invaders, the colonial rulers who were there. And finally, it was the British, a seafaring nation, which is so far away from us. They came all the way and, kept us under their rule. And this happened through the maritime route. So, it's important to remember that we continue to be vulnerable, though the total geopolitical scenario has changed. So, with that backdrop of that small video which showed you the attack on Karachi, I'll show you one more video if there is time later, which gives you the multi-dimensional capacity of the Indian Navy, which has aircraft carriers, which has nuclear submarines now, which has our own homegrown destroyers and corvettes which are there. We are making our own submarines now, and of course a comprehensive maritime domain awareness system, which tells you how transparent the oceans are, except for the submarines which can hide. So all of this and more in the next 30-40 minutes or so. So these were the roles that the Indian Navy has been assigned by the Government of India. Please remember that war is the last resort of any nation. Only after you have exhausted all other means, diplomatic means, like in our own Arthashastra, they talk about Sama, Dana, Veda, and Danda. That means, all these four roles are available, and Danda is the last option, which is where the military forces of a nation come in when all other options have been exhausted. So, under this, the objectives that the Indian Navy has set are deterrence against conflict and coercion. We'll give you examples of this a little later. Decisive military victory in case of war, as it happened in 1971 war. Defense of India's territorial integrity, citizens, and offshore assets from seaborne threat, for which it was necessary for the Indian Navy to have a system. We worked with the system of three commands: the Southern Command, Southern Naval Command, the Western Naval Command, and the Eastern Naval Command, which had their own fleets. Of course, later, about 10-12 years ago, the Southern Naval Command became a full-fledged training command because the Indian Navy realized the importance of training. So the sword edge fleets are in the west and in the fleet. And also in 2003, we converted the fortress commander in Andaman Nicobar to be the tri-services command. So where in rotation, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force officers, 3-star rank, they come and look after the defense of Andaman Nicobar as this is again something that has given us a phenomenal advantage, as it is very close to the states of Malacca and Singapore. In fact, from Indira Point, as we normally say, the Indonesian coast is just a stone's throw away. So this is the advantage that we have. Likewise, in the Lakshadweep Minicoy, which is southwest of Kerala, again we have these forward posts. So I would like to look at them as forward posts of India, one on the east coast and one on the west coast, which supports your security architecture by detecting threats at extended distances from the main coast. So this is where you could require proper structure, command control structure, which is what is available, and we'll take that up later. At the moment, all this is controlled from Naval Headquarters, with the two commands out there, and also the Southern Naval Command for training, and the Tri-Services Command in Andaman Nicobar, and of course the Coast Guard, which is also now been put under the Indian Navy after the Mumbai terror attack. So as you know, in Mumbai, came under attack in 2008 by seaborne terrorists, and at that time they decided that the Coast Guard would also come under the purview of coastal and oceanic security. Influence affairs on land. You would be wondering how this is going to happen. Even in Kargil, I happen to be the Chief Staff Officer Operations in Southern Naval Command, and we got the entire fleet from the Eastern Fleet to come and maneuver in the North Arabian Sea. This also put a lot of pressure on Pakistan, because they said perhaps if it spirals out of control, they might land up with another situation like it happened in 71 war, where the Navy imposed a blockade and also ensured that all the supplies to and from Karachi, which is the major port in Islamabad in Pakistan, were sealed. So this was the importance of bringing in influence of the maritime forces on land battle. Even when the present standoff took place with China, we mobilized our forces, and a lot of them were operating in the Western Pacific, from Andaman Nicobar, and in the Bay of Bengal, ready to intervene if it be required. So, and China, as we will discuss later, also has the Achilles heel in its maritime outreach. It has serious issues in reaching out to the Indian Ocean region because of distance, because of the checks that can be imposed through Andaman Nicobar and through Lakshadweep Minicoy, and also because of the extended logistic chain that is vulnerable as far as China is concerned. So, of course, we also need to safeguard India's mercantile marine, which are 90%. Everybody tells you these figures: 90 to 95% of our imports come from the sea, and 70% of it by 90% is by volume, and 70% is by value. So this tells you the importance of keeping our coasts free of threats and keeping the sea lines of communication free of acts such as piracy, which happened. It was prevalent from 2005 to 2013 in a big way along the Somali coast, and therefore we had to work on mechanisms to see that the mercantile marine and maritime trade of Indian flagged vessels, also the global supply ships, was protected. So safeguard India's national interest and maritime security. So these are the missions under that. As you know, the Arihant is commissioned, and we are looking at commissioning the next missile strike capable nuclear vessel. Though we have a no first use option, you should have the entire success of your no first use option in the nuclear dimension comes because of your ability to strike them, should there be a surprise. Then, of course, the maritime domain awareness, for which we have the IMAC, which is located in Gurgaon, and then missions of sea control and denial. The difference is that a sea control is something which can be done by a powerful force, like it was done in 1971 by the Indian Navy. And sea denial is something which can be done by a smaller force, which will use mines, submarines, midgets to deny access to the enemy forces from reaching their shore. Blockade, of which I told you, given the example of Karachi. Power projection. What is power projection? In times of crisis, you have a fleet that is together, which is armed to the teeth, and which maneuvers close to the enemy shores. Because according to the United Nations Conventions on the Loss of the Seas, there is nothing that bars even a warship from going up to the territorial waters, terrestrial nautical miles. So power projection, force projection, sending a message to say, look, don't exceed the envelope of the land battle, which is limited, like in Kargil. Expeditionary officers, operations, companies, making the enemy come under your pressure because of the force that you have, which is posturing close to his shores. Destruction, key lines of communication, introduction, protection. This, of course, goes into the envelope of trade warfare, where it was indulged heavily in World War II. But because of the new changes that have come about in the merchant marine, this is less likely today of anyone engaging in trade warfare. But as an option, it will be exercised and planned in the contingencies of naval forces. Special force operations, you should know that we have our own equivalent of the SEAL. We call Marcos, Maritime Commandos. They're trained extensively and they're top of the shelf. In fact, today, the Marine Commandos, the Garuds, and the special groups from Army are working together, in many areas. And it started off in Dal Lake when the Indian Naval Divers and Marcos operated long ago, when militancy was at its peak in Kashmir, J and Kashmir. Seaward defense, there are many options which are available. You can look at this later. Coastal offshore defense, which includes two additional tiers in addition to the Navy. One is the Coast Guard, the other is the Coastal Security Group, which is manned by the state. Naval cooperation and guidance for shipping. This comes into force both during peace and also during war, but more so during war, when you need to optimize the handling of the merchant ships. In 1971, we took up some ships from the merchant navy and used them for helping us. And even in Iraq-Iran war, you would have seen that many ships were hired to complement the war effort of USA. USA, of course, has the concept called the stuffed, which is ships taken up from trade. And the UK, which won the Falkland War, used the Royal Fleet Auxiliaries, RFAs. So, in our case, we do not have such a reserve force because it is not economical. It is difficult to maintain. For example, after 1971, if there was no war, then if you had to maintain a reserve fleet of merchant ships doing nothing, it would have been a cost on the exchequer. So we should bear these points when we are looking at the missions that are assigned to the Indian Navy. These are the tasks. You can just look at the headings, and we can come back to this with some examples later. So all these are part of the Indian Navy for which they are trained. Surveillance, maritime strike, anti-submarine operations for which you have anti-submarine frigates, you have helicopters, you have fixed-wing aircraft, which like the P-8Is, the IL-38s, and the Dorniers, and the anti-surface operations. Basically, these are both by surface-to-surface missile-capable ships, submarines which can fire missiles, and aircraft like the P-8I or the IL-38, which can carry out anti-surface operations. Anti-air operations, this is done not alone, though we have our own MiG-29s which are operating from the carrier. So when these are outside the range of operation of the Indian Air Force, that's when we will be engaging, or in support of Air Force operations. In fact, during the standoff, many of the naval aircraft were also positioned in the east, and they would be joining hands with the Air Force. So now, of course, there's a talk of the integrated theater commands. So till that takes place, it will be a question of how these joint operations are planned to optimize the resource allocation and utilization. Amphibious operations, we are well equipped, and we will show you some of these later. So with far-flung islands, which is 540 plus in Andaman Nicobar, and more than similar numbers in Lakshadweep, there will be a requirement for supporting not only the population there in peacetime, but also to use that as launching pads during your campaigns, if should it be required, both on the east and the west. And information operations, information exchange is something that goes on. Here is where there is something called the Data Fusion Center in Singapore, and the IFC, which is the International Fusion Center in Singapore. And they are something which are important in terms of providing the right kind of information for knowing where ships are and who are the ones who are safe, need not be worried about, and who are the ones who are gray ships or black ships who need to be investigated. So there are also issues of electronic warfare, mind warfare, visit board search and seizure, which is a peacetime activity. You see a suspicious ship who does not, obey your orders, does not identify who he is, does not tell you what he is carrying, does not have a proper manifest. So in that case, you are authorized to board this. It's called the VBSS, visit board search and seizure. This would require enforced boarding. It could be done by helicopter, it could be done by boat, and so this is where. So why I'm giving you all these tasks is to tell you how multifaceted the naval operations are, and what is the kind of a training that goes into preparing these people, because sea is unforgiving, and on both sides you might see only some of those ships which are sailing in peacetime, but when you see them operating in sea state 7 and 8, as it happened during the rescue operations recently of Bombay, you will know that one has to put in all the resources, all the training, and all the capability to be able to operate in such bad weather conditions. So in the next level of diplomatic roles, after all, like I told you, it is diplomacy that has to succeed. Even in the famous Doklam standoff, it was diplomacy that finally paved the way for resolution of 73 days of standoff. This time, it has still not been resolved, but only a partial success was achieved. It is at this time that the naval missions become important in terms of what message do you convey to your adversaries. In this case, we looked at a constructive marine engagement through the Quad, on which we can talk about. So Quad is, everybody has told you, it's not a military alliance. It doesn't matter to us. It's the question of what it can become and what message can it convey to people who are out there. So it need not be that the American forces or the Japanese forces will come to fight with you, but as long as they're exchanging information, giving you intelligence, giving you logistic support, giving you fuel if required, having cross operation ability, that's good enough. So these are the objectives in terms of assisting the diplomatic initiative that a nation may have taken. So the moment, the other day there was this photo which was flashed, which was actually of a returning submarine, which was going back to Vladivostok. I'm talking about Chakra. This was well before it finished its, lease. It had to go back because of certain reasons. So, but in terms of psychological operations, all that is required is a photograph like this, which goes out to say that the nuclear submarines are being deployed in South China Sea by India. It is disinformation, but it's something that can be used by your presence in areas where it would perhaps put a certain amount of pressure on the adversary and facilitate the process of diplomatic resolution of a standoff as it's happening right now. And these are some of the missions under that, which include peacetime deployments, flag showing port visits, which is happening for not today, it's been happening since the day the Navy was commissioned, where they would go and carry out exercises with foreign navies. They carry out missions, like Malabar exercise or Indra, Varuna. So all this is something, what it does is, it exposes you to the available levels of technology in other navies, brings in a certain amount of bonhomie in terms of interoperability. It also gives you certain options in terms of how to facilitate discussions elsewhere. So you can just look at the headings. I'll come back with examples because examples will be more interesting to listen than looking at just the headings. But this is something which has been going on for the last 7 decades since our. That also all the people here would be aware that it was Indian Navy that was instrumental in bringing about this forum called the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. It started off here in Delhi, and then it's going around. It's become an important forum for looking at the developments globally and trying to synergize your efforts for ensuring that the seas which link continents remain peaceful, and there is a rule-based order that would be applied in these areas. So these are the diplomatic missions to strengthen political relations and goodwill, strengthen defense relations with friendly nations. So all this is related to what you do. What do you do there? Why are the ships going there? I'm sure these are some of the questions. It's very simple. When you have a ship, an 8,200 tonner built by India, like the Kochi class, which goes all the way to, let's say, Singapore, Malaysia, East Asia, Japan, they also look at the ability of the nation to build their own warships, to integrate weapon systems, to competently man them, manage them, run them, and exploit them. So these are the missions, that are not out of sync with the reality of projecting power. So we always been talking about, power posturing and power projection. So these are integral. So when you go out and exercise with the Japanese Coast Guard or the Navy of Malaysia, they come to know where do you stand in terms of your preparedness. So it has a two-way benefit. One is that they know where you stand, and you familiarize yourself with the environment of the maritime environment. What did the Chinese do? They used the excuse of Somali pirates to deploy 2 ships every time, commencing 2008. And to date, there are over 360 missions that they have taken. That means every time 2 would come, they would stay for 30, 40 days, go back, another 2 would come there. So what it has done is, it's given them the ability to understand the environment, monitor the kind of shipping that takes place, keep a record and update their databases, and be prepared. Because they also have huge interest in the Indian Ocean region. They also commissioned a military base in Djibouti. So this is where you need to understand the importance of strong modern navies who can complement comprehensive national power. So what are the constabulary roles? These are at the lower spectrum, obviously, but equally important in my role, whether it is about coastal and offshore security, security of exclusive economic zone. As you may have been already told, that we have an exclusive economic zone of 2.01 million square kilometers. Thanks to Lakshadweep Unicoi, thanks to Andaman Nicobar, it's given us a large chunk of EEZs. It's also called EEZs, so it's exclusive economic zone, where it's Indian efforts which will allow India as a sovereign nation to not exploit the resources, but to harness the resources. This is important distinction between exploiting and harnessing. So, as part of the Blue Economy initiatives, in the exclusive economic zone, you have exclusive rights for fishing, for offshore mining, for having energy options in the through the old offshore thermal energy options. So there is so much that can be done in the exclusive economic zone, and if there are such initiatives out there, it becomes the responsibility of the Indian Navy and the Indian Coast Guard to protect this. After the tsunami, you will know that we launched the data buoy system, which was already there for monitoring ocean thermals, currents, and bathymetry. But we launched the sonobuoy system, the data buoy system, which provides advance warning of any tsunami that's likely to take place based on the earthquakes that take place in the Java Belt. So all these buoys need to be protected. So whatever is within your exclusive economic zone becomes important to monitor them and provide assistance to the organization called NPOL, which is located right here, Naval Physical and Oceanological Laboratory. And good order at sea. What is good order at sea? Basically, there are a lot of issues related to maintaining good order. There are clauses with the United Nations Conventions on the Laws of the Seas. There are issues related to IUU, which stands for, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. A lot of people are coming here into our exclusive economic zone and taking away, they're looting the fisheries wealth in Indian Ocean region. So you require credible surveillance architecture to be able to spot them and take preventive measure to see that they do not take away your wealth. And what are the missions under this? Counter-terrorism, which has assumed increased importance after Mumbai terror attack. And the most of the people who came there, though there is official record to say that they were all trained by the Pakistani Navy and on waterfronts in chosen locations. The fact that they were able to surprise us in Mumbai and caused mayhem there, is something which thereafter brought about the process of evaluating our preparedness for preventing such attacks, which is when in 1999, after the Kargil, actually it is after Kargil, it is not after the Mumbai terror attack, that the group of ministers came together and gave you prescriptions for preventing such attacks both over the land border and through the sea border. So this again became a mission for this, and as I told you, after the Mumbai terror attack, the Indian Navy now controls the entire maritime domain and uses assets from the Coast Guard and the Coastal Security Group for having an effective mechanism to plot any such attacks in future. So what are these tasks? Counter infiltration, maritime patrol, which is done regularly. It's not only along the coast and in chosen areas by the Coast Guard and the Navy, but also in sensitive areas such as Bombay Hide, or in the island groups, or in areas where there has been intrusion from the Chinese vessel. There were reports about the Chinese submarines entering our exclusive economic zone, the research vessels entering our areas of interest, and therefore this is where your maritime patrol, particularly by modern aircraft such as the P8I, which operates from INS Rajali. It was a great honor for me to be the first commanding officer of INS Rajali. Today they have a squadron plus of the P8I, formidable aircraft, and it's a matter of great pride for Indian Navy that they were requested to operate along the LAC for providing certain elite information to the Army and the Air Force along the LAC, after the standoff last year. So, no, this becomes an important dimension. No, though we call it maritime patrol, the point is that the suites that they carry, the electronic suites, are multifaceted. They can be used over land, they can be used at sea, and also in the air. So anti-piracy, now we also have registered, we are not actually part of any structured alliance for combating maritime patrol, but we've been carrying out these patrols and we rescued many ships. The record, including one rescue of a Chinese vessel. So we are looking at, providing something which ensures that the seafarers do not lose confidence in the ability of maritime security forces. Anti-poaching is related to the incursions which are done by fishing vessels from our neighboring countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Taiwan, and a whole lot of people are all over here for one simple reason, that our own fishermen are quite content to fish along the coast. Whereas what is required today is an effort to go deep into the sea in multi-day vessels, what we call deep sea fishing. There's only recently that there is some efforts to increase the number of deep sea vessels, but till that is sorted out, we'll continue to find people from foreign fishing fleets poaching in our areas. Anti-trafficking becomes an important aspect of our task, which is related to preventing contraband, smuggling, human trafficking, etc. I'm sure you monitored that off Lakshadweep Manikar in March. The Coast Guard was able to catch boats which are carrying narcotics, which are carrying arms, ammunition, and currency. So this is where a lot of efforts are required for complementing our tasks. So what are the benign roles? This is at the lower spectrum, but it's even more important today because we have not fought a war since 1971. And therefore, whereas the fishermen will be out at sea on a day basis, the merchants will be out there, there will be natural disasters like these two cyclones which hit us. There is a Tate which is there, or the Yas which hit the east coast. So the Navy, the Coast Guard, the maritime forces will have to be on constant alert to provide help and succor to the people who are affected or likely to be affected in such calamities. So one is about promoting civil safety and security. This is part of all the civil armed forces. We call it aid to civil authorities. So this is exercised in each of the place. There is something called a CIMILAC, which is the civil military coordination, which is controlled between the civil authorities and whoever is a naval or an air force or an army officer who would be looking at the issues related to what kind of contingency plans are to be in place. It's also become a little more easier today because you have a proper NDMA, National Disaster Management Authority, who have their national disaster forces distributed along the entire thing, and you will see regular newspaper reports that tells you that we have uh, prepared well. We evacuate a lot of people. They come with boats, with rations, with medical aid, and all that, and including in times of. So this is something that's important to use the. But please remember that after the tsunami, though even our own east coast was hit, it was the Indian naval ships which reached Indonesia within 24 hours. They went there with medical aid, with evacuation kits, with divers, and this is when the soft power potential of the Indian Navy came to the fore. The Navy and Coast Guard were there. They are almost the first responders in any kind of an emergency, and even in our neighborhood Sri Lanka, where after the tsunami, the GAL was littered with debris, and the harbor could not be used. It is the Indian Navy divers who went there with a ship and cleared the approaches to GAL harbor. This was during tsunami when we are fighting our own battle along our east coast, which was equally badly hit. So this is the capability, capacity, that is already available, but it is the intent of the leaders that will apply this to achieve better results. What are these missions? Today, increasingly, we refer to these as humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. A to civil, other to which I covered. No, we were in the forefront of carrying out survey for our nations, neighboring nations. And the Indian Navy was one amongst the first to set up from the Hydrographic Survey of India. So the Indian Navy acquired their own ships. And in fact, very recently, one of those ships was decommissioned. But they were the ones who were employed in Oman, in Bangladesh, in UAE, and other places for carrying out hydrography and preparing hydrographic charts. And this is something that gives you, one, access to a different area which is of importance, and also enhances your capability to build up these kind of relations which are important with our neighboring nations. Search and rescue, less said the better, because every other day you have a need, and you can see this. This is from the latest thing which took place of Bombay. This is one of the ALH which the Navy has acquired. It's indigenous, and the amount of people who are rescued from P305, which was a barge which was there, which was a deep support vessel of Bombay High that collided after the Assam. Unfortunately, there are many things which went wrong there, but it is to the credit of the Navy that despite the heavy weather, with high sea states, with 15 meters high waves, they were able to evacuate many of the people from the Bombay High region. And ships such as Cochin, which are destroyers, you must listen to some of the first-hand accounts that are given by the people on the scene. It is important at those sea states to even manage when to switch off your engines, because the propellers are churning, and do you want to cut off somebody into two by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it was phenomenal in the manner that they executed this task. And so this is what we've done. The Indian Navy sailed their ships to break up the oxygen to concentrators, medical supplies. They supplied it to other nations, and we also got it from outside. And we also carried out tasks to evacuate our people after the Libya encounter. And also recently, when there was a huge requirement, not only did they engage the supporters of merchant navies, but since warships are always available, and we have a huge ship called Jalashwa, which was procured after the tsunami, and all these were put into motion to get the best out of the situation. Here you can see the seeking helicopter, where people are in PPE kit and bringing people. Because remember, it was not just evacuating somebody who was, a survivor. It was also important to ensure that the COVID protocols were followed. So it placed a phenomenal amount of load on the people who are carrying out this search and rescue task, particularly during the COVID time. So this tells you. So this, I thought I'll basically today cover the roles of the Indian Navy as it has been assigned by the Government of India, and tell you how we've done it with some examples. But I thought I'll give a little more time for questions so that I can take and expand the scope of these discussions. So with that, over to you, Dr. Anand.
Thank you, sir, for that very comprehensive lecture. I think that must have certainly helped our students understand what is exactly the role of Navy, and I really like the way in which you have scattered across a few examples on how to relate some of these roles with the activities which are already undertaken by the Indian Navy. Certainly, the Indian Navy has contributed a lot to our national defense and national security. So thank you. Now I will go to the Q&A session. I can see a lot of hands over here. A lot of students have some questions. Aishwarya, can you go ahead first? These are, by the way, sir, these are all our first year master's students.
Good.
Yes, Aishwarya.
Yes, sir, thank you for that wonderful presentation, sir. I had few questions, a couple of questions. The first thing is with regard to the ISR capability of Indian Navy. So, with the coming of P8I and Information Fusion Center, will Indian Navy be able to tackle like the Chinese efforts to come into this China Colombo port? And we have a maritime terror group which is very near to India, the Sea Tiger. So, will this ISR capability of India is enough to tackle such things? And the next question is with regard to the disaster management. Like we have this information fusion center which is located like IMAC as well, it is located in the Gurgaon and all. So with this wide shipping agreement, everything is with regard to intelligence sharing in terms of security. So whether do we have any meteorological station wherein they exchange this climatic condition, everything, because at present Indian Ocean region is highly prone to cyclones and all. Like if we would have had that, nearly 51 persons were dead in this near cyclone which hit in this Mumbai thing. I really appreciate the effort taken by the Indian Navy, but then that accident could have been prevented with good policing in that region. And next thing is, while talking about these naval exercises, so last year I was doing a small research on this. So I came to this reading with certain scholars, like while exchanging the technology during the naval exercises, especially when Malabar exercise was conducted between US and India. So the main agenda with the US was to test what all capabilities are there with India, which USSR shared with India. So and now we have conducted this Malabar exercise recently, and we have this freedom of navigation thing with Americana. So how far does this Malabar exercise, such Varuna exercise, help India's engagement with other navies? And another question is with regard to net security providers, sir. So can we say that just because there is no great power in this region, that is leading to further more and more security issues? For example, say USS Cole destroyer was attacked in this Indian Ocean region rather than in the other regions. So just because there is a political instability and such vulnerability in the region, this great power ships or destroyers are being attacked in this region. So how far will India's Sagar mission, net security provider thing would be able to tackle this?
Thank you, Aishwarya. There's so many questions. It's almost like a lecture, but I must compliment you on your knowledge and the kind of effort that you have put in to understand the issues related to maritime security. So the first question first. This was related to the Colombo developments, the information sharing, etc. In case I forget something, just remind me. Just tell me what the brief thing is, and then I'll take it on, because I may not remember all the questions. So as far as Colombo is concerned, China coming in here, it was expected. It was already come to Hambantota, and we knew that Hambantota is something, though it's a loss-making port. China wanted footprint in the Indian Ocean region, and it could not have asked for anything better than Hambantota. Unfortunately, I think India is to be blamed, because just after the defeat of the LTTE, the Hambantota, which is also the constituency of Mahinda Rajapaksa, was offered to India first. So it is India's hesitation and the standard bureaucracy that came in the way of our taking on this offer of developing Hambantota. We should not have worried about money. We should not have worried about anything else, except to say that it's going to keep people out of Sri Lanka. We should have invested money in there. So we lost out that opportunity. So it's pointless, crying over split milk. So now, when they are now come to Colombo port city, no, is it a very dangerous thing? Yes, there are dangers associated with the enemy at your doorsteps. But please remember that all, whether it's Hambantota or whether it is Colombo port city, all these are within striking distance of the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force of India. Not that I'm saying that there will be a war, but as and when it comes, the positional advantage continues to be with India. So, the BrahMos can knock off all the facilities in Hambantota. The MiG-29s can knock off things which are there. I'm not saying it will go up to that place, but they are also conscious of the fact that there is a limitation on the ability of Sri Lanka to support Chinese forage into the region. The foreign secretary, who is right now there, an admiral, a retired admiral, he has categorically said that we will not allow Sri Lanka to be used for power play in the Indian Ocean. But how much can he succeed in sticking to the statement is something that we have to watch out. But yes, the information exchange program that we have with many countries, including America, France, and all that, is something which is very strong. And they have what you must have read about as the distinction of the white ships, the gray ships. That means today, every ship that enters the Indian exclusive economic zone, is monitored and it is tracked. So if he has said it is coming from Abu Dhabi or some other place and saying that, I'm going to Bombay, he's tracked all the way to see whether the speed, the positions that he's reporting, which is supposed to report every day, is something that he's sticking to, or is there something else which is there? There are also other systems which I'll not go to. I can come back another day and tell you about it. The so-called AIS, which is the automatic identification system, which are fitted on the ships, and that is continuously on. It is mandatory for these ships to keep it on. It tells you what is the name of the ship, what is the cargo, what is the master of the ship, what is the position, what is the speed rate. So all this, what it helps you is to filter the entire maritime plot at Gurgaon, where the IMAC is located, and there the countries which are already exchanging information with you are also helping you out. So anyone who is not within this maritime plot is the one who is to be investigated. You don't have to investigate every one of them. And also there's something called the ISPS, International Ship and Port Security Code System, that makes it mandatory for ships to report their position something like 4 days before, 96 hours before. So started with America, but now it's almost become compulsory after the Mumbai terror attack. So they have to tell you when are they going to reach you, what is the cargo they are carrying, etc. So what I'm saying is there's a phenomenal amount of information which is out there, which can be used for spotting the likely black ship amongst the entire number of ships which are transiting. I know annually there are some 10,000 ships which transit the sea lanes of communication. And so the exchange from IFC, which is in Singapore, where we got our own naval officers and Coast Guard officers operating from DFC, they are monitoring the entire situation, and there's real-time exchange of this information. So that's not an issue. What is the third question? Just briefly.
Is there any meteorological agency?
Yeah, okay. So I'm sure your reference is to what happened on the Bombay High. I have gone through this. I have also on the TV explaining my views to this on 80 minutes on the YouTube. You can have a look at it for details. It's very simple. Something like 4,200 fishermen were warned by the Indian Coast Guard. In fact, some of them went on helicopters to those who could be reached. And on the loud hailer, they told them return to harbor, because they expected the gale force of something like 160, 180 kilometers. Now here is one vessel, P305, which had 8 anchors, down below. And the master, in assessment, decided that the storm will pass and it will not affect it. So this was a serious error of judgment on his part. And that P305 sank. It uprooted itself. All the anchors gave way. It went and hit the starboard side of this. The starboard is the right side of this vessel. It hit one of the legs of the offshore platform, and it thereafter started taking in water. Because of the highway, many of them sank without any rescue being provided. The first-hand accounts are all available on YouTube, and you can see them and tell you it is nothing to do with the ability of the nation to forecast. It was something that was not complied with. If 4,200 small vessels can come back to harbor based on the advice that was given, where was the need for this guy to carry on staying there and putting out his chest out and saying nothing will happen to me? The first-hand account tells you that some of the crew members from there have said the captain said kuch nahi hoga. No, so this kind of thing is something which is so therefore the entire procedure that is there for bringing these ships back in such eventuality is something that must be mandatory. You should be able to overrule the assessment of the master who is out at sea. We have much more information to Skymet, we have to IMD, we have the international systems. We're all giving you real-time feed and giving you 78 to 96 hours of warning to say what the wind speeds will be. So I think this is a grave error of judgment, and there's a board of inquiry which has been ordered for this. But the capability of the country to use the existing meteorological systems of the world on its own is quite good. So you are on the safe side. You don't go exactly by the track which is predicted. It could deviate 100 kilometers left or right. So take precautions as if it's going to catch that kind of a havoc, and don't be complacent. That's the message that came about after this. So nothing to do with the meteorological capability of the nation or the ability to forecast, but the stupidness of people who are in the chain who disregarded the warnings that came their way. What is the fourth question?
So can I add on to that thing? Like my
Yeah.
question was referring to, like, we have this data fusion with Singapore, right? So
Yeah.
it is connecting all Indian Ocean regions. So as now we can see lot of cyclones affecting in this region, do we have this meteorological station which collect the information of all these nations? Like,
Yeah, that is quite natural. It is done on a daily basis. It doesn't require the IFC to do that because the IFC role is not for weather sharing, though they can do it. It is more for sharing information on ships that are transiting from one side to the other, analyzing their position, intended movement, and then feeding it to a system which analyzes their data. So there is ship X, which has been transiting a particular area. They put it in the database, and that tells you that this ship was involved in drug traffic in the year 1999. So that's the kind of data that's available. And they can also, the IFC and the DFC today, along with what's called RECAP. I'm not sure if you heard of that organization. It's called the Regional Cooperative Agreement Against Armed Piracy and Robbery. It is located in Singapore, close to the Changi Airport. So they are in a position to involve the Interpol in identifying the antecedents of a vessel that is transiting, from place A to place B. So IFC's role is not the weather management, but the IMD has institutional arrangement for sharing data, but it is mandatory. It is mandatory for them to share such data. If you know that there is a structured mechanism to name these storms when they form, wherever they form, names are chosen, names are given. So there is an international organization which works on warning people who are likely to be affected, countries which are likely to come in the track. Like, how did we prepare for evacuating nearly 2 lakhs from Orissa? It's because of this consolidated picture of weather that was provided to people and nations so that the NDRF could run into, the state authorities can come in, the Army, Air Force, Navy can come in, and they can get into the picture. What is the last question?
The last question is that the net security, this India Sagar vision,
okay.
and this net security provider, and not Indian Ocean not having a great power.
It's like this. You have to look at the position of India. Everybody tells you that this is a nation that is jetting like a sword into the Indian Ocean and bifurcating it into Bay of Bengal on one side and Arabian Sea. It's a fact. 7,516 kilometers, if you want to use it intelligently, on the offshore islands is an asset. So there are questions about the ability of Indian Navy to be a net security provider. So there is a small semantics that is there. Are you a net security provider or are you a net security facilitator? With the existing mechanisms that we have, we are in a position to work together to provide security, stability, and prosperity in the region of our interest. It is not just in the exclusive economic zone, which is 2.01 million square kilometers, but it is also in the SRR, which is called the search and rescue region. That is double the size of your exclusive economic zone, search and rescue region. Here is where we have the maritime rescue coordination centers manned by the Coast Guard on both the coast and in the islands, and they are the ones who will receive the first information through a direct line from ISRO, because they are the ones who are monitoring the distress frequencies. These are picked up by the satellites and processed in ISRO Bangalore, and immediately on the hotline they are sent to the maritime rescue coordination centers in Bombay, Chennai, in Cochin, in Port Blair, and other places. So after you receive that information on distress, that facilitates a search and rescue process. In terms of the net security provider, you made a reference to the USS ship that transited. That takes us into the other areas of the United Nations Conventions on the Laws of the Sea. As per the UNCLOS, it does not prohibit a warship from coming even up to the territorial water, number one, and also for using your territorial water after informing you. That means it can sail close to Chennai or Bombay within the territorial water after having made its intentions known. It is Indian Constitution, which is the Maritime Zones of India Act 1976, where they tried to impose some additional restrictions on warships which are using the exclusive economic zone. But that was specific to a warship that may use the exclusive economic zone for weapon firing and weapon exercise. But in this case that you referred to indirectly was carrying out a passage which is well on somewhere close to the sea lines of communication. Legally speaking, India cannot compel warship from China or America or anywhere for that matter from transiting through your exclusive economic zone unless they are involving in weapon firing. This was not the case. Yes, we created a storm in a teacup because the laws were interpreted on both ways, and of course, in the interest of bonhomie and good relations, all that the American ship was to say that I'm transiting through this for information. Not that we did not know. The IMAC already knew the position, the procedure, and there are American naval officers who are sitting there in the IMAC. I'm sure the information exchange has taken place. But the fact that they made an insensitive statement, this came of course from the ship side and the fleet side, that was unwarranted. It undoubtedly created a furor which was not warranted. No, the fact that the ship was transiting was known to people in IMAC. I'm talking about the Maritime Domain Awareness Center in Gurgaon. So we honestly created a furor which is there. And as far as your reference to the, are we giving away too much when you're exercising with others? It is never the case, because there are always, whether it's your radars, whether your sonars, whether your weapons, particularly weapons which are indigenous, you never share those frequencies during peacetime. Your radars do not operate on those frequencies, because if they are operating on those frequencies, you can capture the electronic signature, and this can be stored in the database tomorrow. So even if one transmission goes out from this radar or from sonar, the identity of the platform can be compromised. So when we go to this, we take precautions, and also Americans also take precautions. Obviously, they do not want to give away everything that is there. So therefore, what it does is that it brings you to a level field where you're only looking at what are the areas in which you incorporate. The Malabar is not exercise of today. Malabar 2020, which has been going on for since '95. So in each, we have moved up. We've enhanced the scale of interaction. We have brought in submarines. They have brought in submarines. We've done so much more, which is there, and this is where it has phenomenal amount of experience, expertise that gets added with each successive edition of the Malabar. It's not just with America. We are doing with France. We are doing with Russia. We are doing with the smaller neighbors here through the process of what's called Dosti, where Sri Lanka, Maldives, and India come together for looking at Coast Guard interaction. So with each of this, what it does is it will make you realize as to what your strengths are, number one, what your weaknesses are in terms of technology gaps, and what perhaps are standard operating procedures that perhaps requires a revisit so that it aligns itself with modern practices. So I am not for a moment going to say that these exercises will compromise on your preparedness or your security or your weapon and sensor capability. Next.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yes, Rikutan.
Thank you, sir, for the talk. It was wonderful listening to you. I have a couple of questions. I'm not a maritime student, so some of them may be wrong. So, first one is regarding the your take on the spending on the Navy, sir. Manavendra Singh's article on print showed how we have been neglecting the Navy for a long time, giving over emphasis to the armed forces. So, I mean, the army. So, why do we still have that kind of a neglect towards the Navy, and how do we overcome this?
Yeah, I'll take one by one so that I don't forget.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Yeah, I'll take one by one. I'll quickly respond to this. You can also follow up if there is a follow-on question. As far as this is a fact, the Navy has always been a centralized service, and the percentage has never been more than 18 to 20%, and it's come down in the recent years. It's more to do with the total national capability and the restructuring of the armed forces and the what we call a mindset at Delhi, which we always accused of ocean blindness. So we said, they're not interested. But I think slowly all this is being overcome. We definitely require more money. But look at what all has happened. Just the other day we signed, for these submarines to be made here. We made our own nuclear submarine. Your second strike capability was nowhere if INS Arihant was not on the scene. So particularly it became more important when you had a NFU. So money has been coming in fits and starts, but yes, you require a lot more. And with the emphasis on the Indo-Pacific area, where everybody is trying to become relevant because of the tensions there, because of China's interest in South China Sea, West Pacific, and the Indian Ocean region, and the West Indian Ocean region, North Arabian Sea, the collision with Pakistan, the importance of spending more on Navy is inescapable. So, we had to pitch for it. I'm sure the government is aware. Unfortunately, the COVID has put paid to your aspirations in terms of how much can be allocated. But please look at it in another way. We are always saying that our percentage spending of defense in terms of the total GDP is less than 2.5%. So, but as long as the gross product keeps growing, the money available to you for investing in naval assets, infrastructure, modern technology, etc., and even indigenization would become more. But I am totally in agreement with Admiral Madhavendra Singh and many others before him to say that we need more allocation for the Navy, because this can be this can make a difference between winning and losing, particularly when it comes to China. Next.
Sir, the other question is regarding India's policy. We don't go and approach any country to build any overseas facilities or naval bases. So, do you think there is a I think that's according to my reading, I think it is like that. So, do you think there is a need to review it, because China is seeking to expand and it is trying to get over India's neighbors in the Indian Ocean, say Maldives. So do you think that India needs to do something, and which area do you think India needs to focus on? Would it be Trincomalee, or say the Port Louis, Port Victoria, or those islands of France in the Indian Ocean?
Okay, there are two components to your question. So the one question is about China's interest in the Indian Ocean region and their being an aspirational power who would like to displace USA. They are looking at Indian Ocean, which is why Djibouti came in first. There's a first military base. Gwadar, you can say, by default it will become a naval base because the entire thing is funded by China. So you already have the adversary who George Fernandez called enemy number one at our doorstep. With the Hambantota and with the Colombo Financial City, they are even closer today. In Maldives, luckily for us, the democratic system threw open challenges for everyone out there. But the Yamin, who was favorable to China, was thrown out, and today we have Maldives, which is favorable to us. Bangladesh, Myanmar, it's been ups and downs, and Bangladesh again, because just like Gwadar provides a gateway to the North Arabian Sea for China, and also opens up an avenue for overcoming its Malacca dilemma. I'm talking about the dependency on energy for energy security. The Bangladesh route, will help China to get access in the Bangladesh, to the Bay of Bengal. So, which is why they are accelerating the process of not just engaging with Bangladesh, but also through Myanmar. So, they're looking at the China-Myanmar economic corridor, just like the China-POK economic corridor. In all my analysis, I've never called CPC as China-Pakistan economic corridor. I've always referred to it as China-POK economic corridor. It's important, but otherwise you'll be legitimizing their claim on that being part of Pakistan. So this is the first part about China's interests. The second part of what India can do is very simple. We have not been able to manage our neighborhood, whether it is Sri Lanka, whether it's Maldives, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Myanmar. We have not been able to manage for one simple reason. We do not have the kind of money that China has. China, through the Belt and Road Initiative, was able to pump in a lot of money. And every nation requires money, including India. Because if you remember, China continued to be the big trading partner for us. And even during the standoff, there's a lot of trade that took place. And the trade deficit was of the order of 50 to 60 billions. And that is the money that's being invested in the China-POK economic corridor. That means indirectly, through this trade deficiency, you are funding the aspirations of China in these areas. Okay, so that is the harsh reality. So what more can we do? We need to be able to use the so-called soft power, which is not taken off much, because you need to be able to put money where your mouth is. And that capacity we do not have, particularly post-COVID. China's economy, which I keep quoting, is of the order of 15 trillion US dollars. Our economy is 2.8, struggling to reach 3 trillion. Let's call it 3 trillion. That makes it 1/5 the capacity of China to spend. They also have a US 3.2 trillion US dollars, which is in terms of treasury bonds and this, which can be taken out and used where required. They also have the BRICS fund. They also have the ADB. And all this is being used to further their outreach into Asia, Africa, and Europe. So they're not leaving any stone unturned to invest in these areas, whether it is Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Colombo, Port City, etc. And as long as they have a regime that's favorable to their aspirations, like Mahinda Rajapaksa, they have even passed a resolution in Colombo, that this entire thing can be owned by China. So you have this entire area that's going to be there, which will be controlled. Chinese currency will work there, and people are already flashing Chinese passports, as it was shown in Hong Kong, to say that separate passports will be required to enter and leave the city. So I'm sure this will have phenomenal amount of listening devices, modern devices, hacking devices to monitor the oceans around it. But like I said, I go back to what I said earlier. When push comes to shove, all these are within ranges of the missiles. All this. I don't think that will happen. But if that happens, then we have the geographical advantage. We have those missiles which can take on these targets, whether it's in Hambantota or in Colombo Port City or in any of these where China may be making forests. Taking on Gwadar, Karachi, etc. is a different kettle of fish. So I'm not going to talk about that. But like I said, we have failed. I gave you the example of Hambantota. You should have taken over. When the offer was made, you should have taken over. You should not have looked at the money that was going to be there or was going to be wasted. They kept China away. So we have failed by and large, and I hope we have learned. Next.
Sir, one last thing. Are we making the same mistakes in Chabahar?
Oh, Chabahar again, unfortunately, it was offered to you long ago, and we dilly-dallied, and you know how famous we are for our Indian bureaucratic system. We call them the Babus. So the Babus have always let you down because they are very good at file pushing. And Chabahar, which would have become a reality, thanks to this government, at least there was some push, there was funding, and finally the late External Affairs Minister even went there and inaugurated a facility of a berth. But today things are out of our hand because of the American sanctions. The Iran, we are not buying oil from Iran. We are looking at other sources. So why should Iran oblige you? Because the intention of Chabahar was also to connect it to the north-south corridor. You know, there is a famous North-South corridor, and we are supposed to invest there. It should have given you access to Europe and Central Asian Republic. You know, we have let go of this opportunity by our dithering, our lack of efforts, lack of diplomacy, and therefore you will fail in Chabahar. You know, so we'll again come back and write a big discourse on how we lost out in Chabahar, just like we lost out in November. Sad show. Sad show.
Thanks.
Okay. Sir, can we take a couple of more questions?
Sure, most
Is it fine?
most
Okay. And Shishiraj?
Hi sir, thank you for your enlightening lecture. So I had this doubt that recently India has commissioned this sanctioned the building of six conventional diesel electric submarines, but we are also falling short on SSN now that INS Chakra is returned to Russia. So how do you see that shortfall? We are not going to get back any SSN in 4 years until the second one that we have leased from Russia will arrive. And then now that we have also this growing talk that we don't need third aircraft carrier, but Navy insists on that. So how do you see that issue? And there, okay, sir, this is my first question.
Okay, thank you. It's an interesting question in terms of our second strike capability. That's number one. You know, in terms of the ability to strike either China or Pakistan, because of our stated policy of NFU, do you have that deterrence with you? So with the commissioning of INS Arihan, we acquired that capability. We also carried out missile trials, but the missiles that we have presently, which have been tried out, are of lesser range. Therefore, the deployment patterns of Arihan will have to change. The next one will also come out. So I don't see that they are immediately being required or used unless there is a nuclear war. No country in the world would like to cross the thresholds of a nuclear war. China also has a no first use policy. It's only Pakistan which has a wavering policy of when it would use the nuclear. But we call that bluff post Pulwama because apparently the top echelons there kept on saying that we have not kept our nuclear weapons for Deepavali. So, but now nothing happened. It also did not happen during Kargil. So every nation is careful in crossing the boundaries when it comes to crossing the thresholds of a conventional war. So while Chakra has gone back because of actually it should have continued here, but there are certain other issues related to maintenance. On a wet lease, the Soviets have the Russians have a certain amount of responsibility. We have a certain amount of responsibility. So it was important to return this to Vladivostok. It is gone. It's not a big issue in my opinion. The reason why we want the SSN is to be able to train our crew, and have a pipeline that allows them to be totally familiar with operating of a nuclear reactor, to get used to long patrol deployments out at sea, so that they can immediately go on to INS Arihant, Arigat, or the following. Those programs, luckily, because they are of indigenous, with LNT, with DRDO, with Russian help, what you've done, that's something that will keep us going in terms of the ability to have a second strike capability. So that should not be mistaken. Do we have the second strike capability? Yes. Is it adequate? No. Are we doing something about it? Yes. That's where we stand as far as the second strike capability is concerned. Coming to the aircraft carrier question, no, it's a question of how much of fund do you have, and is it something that you can defer for some time? The Navy has been saying that will require 3. This is based on the famous concept of what's called the war wastage reserve. So even in squadrons, for every aircraft that you acquire, you will have 1.5 acquired. That means if you have 10 aircraft that are required, you'll acquire 15 aircraft, which you'll get for war wastage reserve. Likewise, if you are talking about a requirement for 3 carriers, because each fleet can have 1, while 1 is allowed to be maintained, and therefore there is never a shortage of a carrier, both in the Arabian Sea where things are hotting up, or in the Bay of Bengal where China is making forests. So which is where, but it's now the question of allocation of funds. This will be debated, so there may or may not be an agreeing point on when you would like to have the third carrier while the requirement is understood. And the money and the cost benefit analysis that is there, which is being debated in terms of whether if you have more air bases in Andaman Nicobar, whether you can strengthen the air bases in Kaurati and Roth and other places, and also the new capabilities of the Air Force, which gives a phenomenal range with even one mid-air refueling, like it happened in the case of Pulwama attack. It's not that all of them took off from an airfield base which was next to them. Some of them took off from far-off bases and were refueled to carry out this. So there is a tactical picture which looks at time, distance, and also their endurance. So these are calculations which can now be fed into a computer to decide, what forces are required. Do we have them? Are they adequate? And what are the equations that are available? This is a complicated issue as far as the planners are concerned, which is why there's been a thrust on joint planning, which is why they want the Army, Navy, and the Air Force to be sitting together. Once the theater command comes into effect, maritime theater command, like now that is the first one which is going to come up, is which will show you the way of how will you optimize the resources. So if the Navy has the MiG-29s, can the Air Force use them in certain situations? Or if the Air Force, which also has the maritime strike element in Jaguars and MiGs, can they be integrated into the maritime theater command? How do you exchange ranges by using Car Nicobar on a permanent basis? So there are many of these questions which are there. While the need is, nobody said that it's not required. It's a question of, are you in a position to afford it today? If not, what are the alternatives that we have till we can get out of it? The same question even for the SSNs that you posed earlier. Can we make do with what we have today? If not, when do we think we'll have the right kind of mix of platforms, conventional as well as nuclear platforms that will meet the requirements so that nobody can surprise us? These 6 submarines which are coming there is a good move. It will take many years. Even the Scorpions that we wanted to get did not come on time. There were delays. And also not all of them are coming with the air independent propulsion, AIP. So that will again take a little bit of toll in terms of the preparedness and deployability of the submarines in areas of interest. That's what that is it for, I would always refer to the famous statements that was made by General Malik before Kargil. He says, we do not have everything that we need, but we will continue to fight with what we have, defend the interests of the country. So that spirit is always there. So it's a question of mixing and matching the ability of the platforms from all the 3 services. Like I told you, the special forces from all the 3 forces are working together today. So there are such options which are available, which need to be worked on during peacetime by computer simulations, by scenario building, by operational analysis and operational research. And that will tell you that there are some solutions in the interim period while we wait for funds to be available, particularly post-COVID.
Thank you, sir. I have one more question. Like it's very short. You can give a quick thought. Like we have these issues with MiG-29 with its fly-by-wire and engine. So how do you see that with second aircraft carrier being operational now? Now it will be operational in some time. So how do you see that Navy will manage that with 45 aircrafts only?
Yeah, this has been the problem of bane of indigenization. We've not been able to deliver. As you are aware, you would have seen the videos of the Tejas aircraft, a single-engine aircraft carrying out deck landings, including arrested landings. That means it met the targets of being able to get launched using a ramp, which is what is available in the Vikramaditya, and also it will come on Vikrant tomorrow, and the ability to be arrested by using the HUC. So as a technology demonstrator, they carried out these trials, and it's wonderful. Hats off to the people who were able to achieve this. But the problem with the Navy was that they said, no, with this, we will have the payload restrictions. We need a twin engine aircraft. So HAL is already working on this, the twin engine Tejas, which will, because the concept has been proved in terms of a platform that can take off from a carrier and land on a carrier. That's been proved. So it's a question of working out on the payload, etc. Yes, we've had issues with MiG-29s. The Air Force had those issues. We lost some of the aircraft also. But that is what happens when you are importing aircraft and you are dependent on somebody else's technology. But that's something we cannot get away with. Now we have the Rafales today. So, in the interim period, it's quite possible that, Rafale is also a candidate along with the new variants which are being made available and our own indigenous. I would definitely go along, even if there are limitations, go along with the recommendation to induct the homegrown aircraft, because that's the only way. Unless you learn to walk, you cannot run. So you need to be able to Start walking. It doesn't matter if it's a single engine Tejas. Start flying them. No, you'll get used to the concept of flying from a carrier. We'll train people from there, and then move on to the twin engine, which because already the operational concepts are clear in your mind. The profiles and the flying envelopes, the flight envelopes have been decided. It's only a question of expanding the range. So I am all for supporting the indigenous options. So I was very happy to see that 83 of these Tejas have been ordered at a considerable cost, which will go to the Air Force. It will not come to the Navy. But what happens is the cumulative knowledge that you'll acquire by flying this. Now, during the famous Traya Shakti exercise, when they carried out Gagan Shakti rather, they put Tejas to the maximum test, and they were able to deploy them. They were able to generate the same kind of sortie rates. They were able to shift them from one front to another, and they did very well. So it's full marks to the Tejas team that they've given you a platform that has worked, and Air Force is inducting them in large numbers. So I think Navy, which has been in the forefront of indigenization, will need to follow suit and support this. Yes, there will be limitations, but which aircraft does not have a limitation? So it's for us to now make this happen and not continue to depend on import. Today it will be MiG-29s, tomorrow it will be Rafale, the next one will be F-16s or F-18s or its derivatives. Just because it is an offer, you can't be going there and buying that. Yes, some squadrons will be required, like we got this 36 aircraft of Rafale, because it gave you a certain amount of ability to fix the gap that was there, temporarily bridge the gap that was there in terms of availability of high technology weapons, in terms of platform capability, range, endurance, and multiple roles.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Kiran.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for that wonderful lecture. Like I had a few questions, but most of them were covered with the previous questions. The one query which I wanted to ask is regarding it's kind of a follow-up. Like we did have a plan for the third aircraft carrier, and I guess it was INS Vishal. But again, that was a ski jump model, and that was planned on the Stubar technology. We have a lot of limitations regarding payload in the Tobar technology. So with the growing connections with US, is there any possibility of India incorporating the Catobar technology, sir?
And all these are options which are being analyzed at that naval headquarters level. There are options. People are very happy because it will sustain their military industrial complex, so they are ready to offer anything, including EMALs, which you would have heard about. So, the Catobars, the EMALs, in a bigger carrier, the F-18 or derivatives, or the F-22, whatever. So there will be a lot of offers that will come there because they also like to keep their military industrial complex running. You will remember that they wanted to ship the entire F-16 manufacturing facility to India at one stage while they are closing it down in America, because they try to sell you the idea to say that there are thousands of these aircraft flying in your region and you could be the sole support of these F-16s for next 20, 30 years. So this is commercial. So you need to look at this and see what is it that you can afford, number one, and what are the future platforms that you are devising. Like, whatever you design should be something that should keep in mind the developments that are being made by HAL. And because it should not be something which is specific to an American aircraft or a French aircraft that would come on your ship. So that defeats the whole purposes of so-called Atmanirbharata. So Atmanirbharata cannot remain as a campaign, or a slogan. So it's something that we should be serious about. So all these options must be evaluated because it tells you what's happening in the rest of the world. But it's not necessary that you should be chasing technology. The problem of the armed forces have been that when they make their projections, they want the best, and they want everything to be incorporated into one platform. So that will not happen. You got to be realistic in your assessment of what you want for your country. And so therefore there must be homegrown solutions. So DRDO cannot suddenly be, because after all, DRDO has delivered in some areas, they failed in some areas. What is it that can deliver? What is within the reach of the technological capability of our country? What needs to be imported temporarily, and what needs to be on a TOT basis, transfer of technology basis? Because increasingly we are, insisting that there should be a lot more transfer of technology by people who come here under the DPP, Defense Procurement Policy areas. So this is where we got to get our house in order. Not go around chasing everything because that's it's an offer. It's on what is suitable to you, what is required in the next 30 years. Does it meet your requirement? Does it contribute to your indigenization process? And are funds adequately available? What are the midlife update programs that are required for this platform, both for the ships and for the aircraft? So there are multiple questions which are required to be answered. And just because something is on offer, you can't keep chasing their concepts. One day they'll say, Stobar, we went for the Harrier. Short takeoff but assisted recovery. VL, Stowell, short takeoff but vertical landing. So we went for the Harrier. Next day it said, short takeoff but arrested recovery. So we went for the mix. So it takes off on a ramp but arrested with a hook. Now we are talking about Catabot. So you'll look for the new catapult which will be there, which we used in Vikrant. I operated in Vikrant, so I know about it. So, but today there'll be a new technology that will launch them without the complicated machinery that was required for steam catapults, for VE-MAX. What is the money that you're going to spend? Who's going to maintain them? For how long? What happens in the type of a washer? Even there's a small nut and washer is not available. And sanctions are imposed on that. So the entire, for want of a nail, a shoe was lost. So that is the scenario will be. So I've got to be careful in all this. Good to know about what is happening in the rest of the world, but best to define our role, our areas of interest, our reach, our range in which we are required to operate to protect our interests, and then work on that to get the right kind of technology. Both something like 70-80% should be indigenous. Maybe 20-30% can still be imported because not everything can be manufactured by one country. Even America does not do it. France does not do it. They have multiple sources for supplying these items which are required for making even a Eurofighter or Rafale or any other aircraft. So we need to be conscious of the global practices in making an aircraft or a platform and observe what is relevant.
Yes, I think last question from Gargi.
Good afternoon, sir. That was a very enlightening lecture. I wanted to know about any deep sea or underwater militarization by the Indian Navy as a countermeasure to China's presence in the Indian Ocean region. Or maybe can we expect to see more of it in near future?
Yeah, okay, it's like, it's nothing new as far as this was concerned. This was the old Cold War concept of sources, sound operated surveillance underwater systems, where they used to have an important choke points. They would have underwater boys who should be monitoring the passage of ships. In our case, every vessel that comes from China has no choice but to pass through the Straits of Malacca or Lombok or one of those. And there we have our mechanism to monitor. So once they come into India, where are they? If you see a submarine entering through the Straits of Malacca, but you don't see them the third day, then obviously he's heading somewhere in the Indian Ocean. And everyone tells you that to look for a submarine in the Indian Ocean region, or for that matter in any water, is like looking for a needle in the haystack. So those complications will always be there. But I'm sure the planners in Delhi who will not tell you about it are working on such options which are already tried, experimented, and proven during Cold War for monitoring the movement of submarines in sensitive areas. So, we already have the capability of deploying data buoy systems. It's not nothing new. It's been there for 30-40 years, where they've been deploying data buoys, which will give you real-time data of water salinity, temperature along the depth profiles, transmit through a satellite. The satellite uses all this data, which gives you the complete bathymetric profile. So could these be reconfigured for having additional sensors which can look at what is happening around there? Yes, technically, scientifically feasible. Do you have the money? How long will they sustain themselves? How will you have the energy sources for sustaining these systems which are at distant locations in the oceans? Or is it that can you just deploy them in some critical areas of India? These are questions that I'm sure the Indian Navy is already looked at and they have their answers. So in the peacetime, what you do is to have your surveillance mechanism going through satellites, through surveillance aircraft like the P-8I, the Dorniers, the L-38s. LTUs, of course, have been decommissioned, and helicopters. Every day, believe you me, every day the aircraft are flying in the entire exclusive economic zone of India. in different sectors which have been assigned to see what is happening in terms of movement. These are correlated with what is obtained in the MDA headquarters in Gurgaon. And you look at all of them, analyze them, and in an effort to separate the shaft from the grain. So, that's what happens. You look at all of them and see who are the people who need to be checked. So if there is a gray ship which has to stop its automated identification system and is going from place A to B, and according to his previously given AIS data, he was supposed to come to Bombay, let's say tomorrow, but he is nowhere near Bombay. And at his current rate from his position next to Lakshadweep Minikar, he will take 3 more days to come. So what do? You think this is unusual? Immediately you send a helicopter, you send commandos, you send a ship, you investigate and find out why is he delayed in coming to Bombay? Is he deployed in supplying something to either mercenaries or drug peddlers, or are they involved in human trafficking? So this is how you do the whole thing, and it's a 24/7 business for people sitting in Delhi, in Gurgaon, and in command headquarters in Bombay, in Chennai, in Cochin, in Port Blair, to constantly look at the surface picture, evaluate it, and identify possible threats that may be emanating from the sea towards our coast or vital installations.
Okay, thank you, Gargi. And I think with that, we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you, Commodore Vasan, for spending your valuable time with us, inspiring us, and at the same time educating our students about the relevance of the Indian Navy in India's national security and defense management. So I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart Commodore Vasan's presence today, and a lot of things which we have learned. In fact, our students also have interacted very well and tried to make the best out of this opportunity. And I think we have discussed for almost 1 hour 45 minutes now, and despite this being their lunch time, and also for you, sir. So I think we'll meet again once again for maybe another talk on Indo-Pacific, perhaps. We'll inform you about that, Commodore Vasan. So wishing for more such interactions, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anand. I must also tell you that I enjoyed the interaction because I see that the general awareness of the students who interacted with me is very high. I'm very, very happy that they are keeping such interest alive in terms of understanding the maritime domain. That augurs well for the student community, for the institute, also for the nation, more important. So I'm very happy that they have shown this kind of an interest. I must compliment all of them who posed these very interesting questions, which I can speak for hours, but due to the time limitations which are there, each of these can be expanded to a full lecture. Each of the questions that were asked can be expanded to a full lecture, and I'm sure the students on their own will also be able to invest in this knowledge building up. So I'm very happy for all the students who participated, and thank you for giving me this opportunity, and thanks to Dr. Nandakishore also for inviting. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.